You can fly for years and never think about it. But hidden beneath every safety rule in American aviation is a crash site with names on it. In this documentary, we go back to some of the most disastrous plane crashes in United States history. A frozen Boeing that cannot climb away from the Potomac. A jet that dives into the Everglades with a hidden fire below the floor. These are the accidents that rewrote aviation rules for everyone who flies in America today. Welcome to Terra Obscura. If you want more aviation stories like this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so we can keep telling the real history behind every takeoff. Air Florida Flight 90 was supposed to be a simple winter flight to Florida. On January 13, 1982, a Boeing 737 sat at Washington National Airport, ready to depart for Fort Lauderdale with a stop in Tampa. There were 79 people on board, 74 passengers and 5 crew. Outside, a heavy snowstorm covered the city. The Potomac River beside the airport was a field of broken ice. Because of the storm, the airport closed for a time, then reopened. Flight 90 was sprayed with de-icing fluid at the gate, but after that, the airplane waited in falling snow and slush longer than planned. As they taxied out, the crew used reverse thrust behind other jets, hoping the hot exhaust from aircraft ahead would help clear remaining snow. In reality, that choice blew slush and ice back onto the wings and into the engines. They also left the engine anti-ice system off, even though the temperature and visible moisture clearly called for it. On the way to the runway, the first officer noticed that the engine power readings did not look right for the conditions. The numbers were too high for the way the engines sounded and felt. He mentioned it, but the captain pressed on. There had already been delays. Snow was still falling. Instead of stopping to recheck the engines or return for more de-icing, they continued toward takeoff. When the tower cleared them, the 737 rolled down the slushy runway, and the captain advanced the thrust levers. Because ice had built up on engine probes, the instruments showed higher power than the engines were really producing. At the same time, a thin layer of ice and snow remained on the wings, quietly destroying lift. The crew thought they had full thrust and clean wings. They had neither. The airplane reached rotation speed and lifted off. Almost immediately, the climb felt wrong. The jet struggled to gain height. The speed stopped increasing. Stall warnings sounded as the wings, coated in contamination and fed by reduced power, could not make enough lift. Just beyond the end of the runway, the 14th Street Bridge crossed the Potomac, full of cars and buses moving slowly in the snow. With barely any climb performance left, Flight 90 sank toward the bridge. The landing gear and lower fuselage slammed into the guardrail and vehicles. Several cars and a truck were crushed. 4 people on the bridge were killed. The impact tore pieces off the wings and fuselage. Then the jet slid off the edge, broke apart and plunged into the frozen river. Most of the airplane disappeared under the ice. Only a section of the tail and part of the cabin remained above the water, surrounded by jagged pieces of ice and fuel film. A handful of survivors managed to escape their seats and reach open windows. They clung to wreckage and water just above freezing, unable to swim far or pull themselves onto stable ice. On the shore and the bridge, people watched in shock. Emergency vehicles fought through snow and traffic to reach the riverbank. Even when they arrived, rescuers could not simply wade out through the ice. The current was strong. Anyone who went in risked quickly losing strength and disappearing under broken ice. A United States Park Police helicopter arrived and began hovering low over the river. The crew lowered a rescue line again and again toward the survivors in the water. In the end, only 5 people from the airplane survived. 74 passengers and crew, plus 4 people on the bridge, lost their lives. The images that went around the world were not only of wreckage, they showed a torn tail standing in a field of ice, a helicopter hovering inches above the water, and exhausted survivors being dragged across snow and broken ice to the shore. Investigators later found no single hidden defect that made the crash unavoidable. The key causes were human and procedural. The crew took off with ice on critical surfaces, did not use engine anti-ice, trusted power readings from iced probes, and did not reject the takeoff when their instruments looked wrong. Ground de-icing practices and training also fell short of what the conditions demanded. Out of the Potomac disaster came stricter rules for winter operations across the United States. Airlines tightened de-icing procedures, changed checklists, and reinforced a simple rule for crews. If there is any doubt about contamination on the wings, the airplane does not leave the ground. Delta Airlines Flight 191 was meant to be a routine evening stop on the way from Fort Lauderdale to Los Angeles. On August 2, 1985, the wide-body trijet was descending toward Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with 163 people on board. Thunderstorms were sitting near the airport with dark clouds and rain shafts just off the approach to runway 17 left. From the cockpit, the crew could see lightning ahead but decided to continue. The plan was to slip under the edge of the storm and get in before it grew worse. On final approach, gear down and flaps set, they flew into a curtain of heavy rain hanging from the cloud base. At first, the airspeed jumped. The airplane had flown into a strong headwind, the front side of a microburst. To stay on the glide path, the pilots pulled the power back. Seconds later, everything flipped. The headwind collapsed into a tailwind, and a powerful downdraft shoved the jet toward the ground. The airspeed dropped, lift disappeared, and the airplane started sinking fast. In the cockpit, one pilot warned, "Watch your speed," and the captain urged more power. But by the time the thrust levers went fully forward, they were already too low and too deep inside the microburst to climb out. Short of the runway, the jet slammed into an open field north of a highway. The main landing gear gouged through the wet ground, then the aircraft bounced and skidded toward Texas State Highway 114. It struck a car on the road, killing the driver, then broke apart as it crossed the highway, hit light poles, and finally smashed into two large water tanks at the edge of the airport. The front two-thirds of the fuselage disintegrated in a fireball. Only the tail section separated relatively intact and slid backward into the rain-soaked grass. Airport fire crews reached the wreckage within minutes and found debris scattered over a wide area, burning fuel, twisted metal, and the torn tail lying on its side. In the rear cabin, a small group of passengers were still alive, many of them in the last rows. Rescuers climbed into the broken structure, cut people free, and carried them out in heavy rain and intense heat. Out of 163 people on board, 137 died, along with the driver of the car on the highway. 27 occupants survived, most of them from the very back of the cabin. Investigators later concluded that there was nothing mysteriously wrong with the engines or controls. The core of the accident was the decision to continue the approach into a thunderstorm and the lack of clear training and tools to recognize and escape a microburst at low altitude. At that time, cockpit radar could show rain, but not the dangerous wind patterns inside. Airlines also did not yet have standard escape procedures for sudden wind shear near the ground. Northwest Airlines Flight 255 was the kind of summer flight people take at the end of a holiday. On the evening of the 16th of August, 1987, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 was getting ready to leave Detroit for Phoenix, with 155 people on board. It was just after sunset, the runway lights were on, and thunderstorms earlier in the day had given way to a warm, hazy night. The jet lined up for departure near the end of the runway. Inside the cockpit, the crew had already flown earlier legs that day. They were running behind schedule, working through clearances and checklists as they prepared to take off. Somewhere in that busy flow, one critical step never happened. The flaps and slats, the movable panels on the wings that must be extended for takeoff, were left retracted. The taxi checklist, which should have caught that, was not properly completed. There was one more line of defense. The airplane was fitted with a takeoff warning system that is supposed to shout at the pilots if they advance the thrust levers for takeoff while the airplane is not correctly configured. On this flight, that voice never spoke. For reasons the investigation could not fully prove, the system had no electrical power at the moment it was needed. So when the pilots pushed the engines up for departure, there was no warning at all. From the cabin, everything felt normal. The engines roared, the jet began to roll, and passengers felt the usual push back into their seats. The airplane accelerated down the runway, nose lifting when it reached rotation speed. It did leave the ground, but with clean wings and no extra lift from flaps, it was barely flying. Almost immediately after liftoff, the climb faltered. The jet struggled to gain height, then began to sink back toward the ground while still in a nose-up attitude. With low altitude and obstacles ahead, there was almost no margin. The left wing struck a light pole at the edge of the airport, tearing open the fuel tank. A burst of flame followed as the airplane rolled and descended toward a nearby road. Seconds later, Flight 255 crashed across Middlebelt Road, just beyond the airport boundary. It sliced through rental car buildings, vehicles, and trees, breaking apart and scattering burning wreckage across a wide area. 2 people in cars on the road were killed. Fuel-fed fires erupted along the crash path. There was no time for anyone on board to react or brace. For most of the occupants, the impact forces and the fire left no chance of survival. Firefighters from the nearby town of Romulus reached the scene quickly, but they were met with an almost continuous field of wreckage and flames. In the darkness and smoke, they began to search for any sign of life. For a long time, every body they found was still and silent. Then, under an overturned passenger seat near an overpass, a firefighter saw a small hand move. Strapped into that seat was a 4-year-old girl, Cecilia Seichin from Arizona. She was badly injured, with broken bones and burns, but alive. Her parents and brother, who had been traveling with her, were among the dead. Cecilia would become known in the press as the miracle child, the sole survivor of one of the worst air disasters in Michigan's history. In total, 154 of the 155 people on board died, along with 2 people on the ground. It was the deadliest accident in the history of Northwest Airlines and one of the worst in American aviation to have only a single survivor. The investigation found no hidden structural failure and no sudden weather event. The cause was brutally simple. The airplane took off with its wings in the wrong configuration, the taxi checklist was not properly done, and the takeoff warning system, which should have caught that mistake, was silent. Behind those facts were human factors that investigators see again and again: time pressure, routine, distraction, and a cockpit that moved on without a full, disciplined cross-check. United Airlines Flight 232 started as a normal afternoon flight across the Midwest. On 19th July 1989, a wide-body trijet left Denver for Chicago with 296 people on board, with a later leg planned to Philadelphia. For nearly an hour, the cruise was calm. People were reading, talking, or looking down at the fields of Iowa. At 15:16, everything changed with a single violent bang. The tail engine exploded and metal fragments tore through the rear of the airplane. In a few seconds, all three hydraulic systems were ripped open. The crew suddenly discovered that the control column and pedals did almost nothing. They could not make the nose go up or down. They could not roll the wings left or right. On a jet like this, no hydraulics meant almost no normal control at all. The captain and first officer tried everything they had been trained to do. The autopilot disconnected. The airplane started to roll and pitch on its own. Gauges for all three hydraulic systems went to zero. There was no checklist for this situation, because engineers had believed it was too unlikely to happen. Then a small chance appeared. A DC-10 training captain named Denny Fitch was riding as a passenger. He came forward to help and took over the throttles. They discovered that by changing the power on the two wing engines, they could push the nose up or down and make the airplane drift left or right. It was a crude tool. Every change in thrust took seconds to show up and often went too far. The jet entered a slow up and down cycle, gaining and losing hundreds of feet each time. With each swing, it lost altitude. The crew used radio and radar vectors to aim themselves towards Sioux Gateway Airport, the closest place with a long runway. For about 40 minutes, while emergency services in Sioux City prepared, the airplane traced wide right turns over Iowa. In the cabin, flight attendants moved through the aisles, explaining how to brace, moving children next to adults and clearing loose objects. Many passengers later said they knew the landing would not be normal, but they also felt a strange calm because the crew sounded focused and honest on the intercom. As they lined up with runway 22, the crew knew they would only get one try. They could not flare in the usual way. They could not correct quickly if the nose dropped or if a wing dipped. The goal was to arrive roughly lined up with the landing gear down and hope the airplane stayed together long enough for some people to get out. On final approach, the up and down swing tightened. Just before reaching the runway, the nose dropped, and the right wing began to fall. Fitch pulled one throttle back and pushed the other forward, trying to catch it, but the response came too late. The airplane touched down in a right bank, the right wingtip and engine striking the runway first. The jet slammed into the ground, broke apart, and tumbled in a cloud of dust, fire, and debris. Parts of the fuselage cartwheeled into a cornfield beside the runway. Fuel spilled and ignited. When the smoke began to clear, the destruction looked total, yet large sections of the cabin had stayed more or less intact, and many seats had remained attached to the floor. Passengers and crew who were still conscious began to unbuckle, shout to each other, and look for daylight. Firefighters and rescue teams, who had been warned well in advance, were already racing toward the wreck and were able to reach survivors within minutes. Out of the 296 people on board, 112 died. Miraculously, 184 survived, many of them with serious injuries, but alive. For an airplane that had lost all normal control, it was a result no simulator session had ever produced. Later tests with experienced crews showed that in most attempts, the airplane either missed the runway completely or crashed in a way that left almost no survivors. Investigators and safety experts agreed that the way the crew managed to keep the jet roughly lined up and get it onto an airport at all was extraordinary. The technical cause of the accident was traced to a hidden crack in a fan disc inside the tail engine, a tiny defect from manufacturing that had grown over thousands of hours until it finally failed. After the crash, rules for inspecting critical engine parts were tightened, and designers took a harder look at how independent hydraulic systems really were. Training departments also began to talk more openly about so-called impossible failures and the value of crew resource management, where every skilled person on board is used, just as they used Denny Fitch that day. TWA Flight 800 was a summer night flight that never made it past the shoreline. On July 17, 1996, a Paris-bound jumbo jet took off from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport with 230 people on board. It was a popular evening departure. Tourists, families, students, and business travelers heading across the Atlantic, with Paris as the first stop and Rome beyond that. The weather was clear, and the climb out over Long Island seemed uneventful. About 12 minutes after takeoff, while the airplane was still climbing over the Atlantic south of Long Island, it vanished from radar. Controllers saw the symbol flicker and disappear. Pilots in other aircraft reported a bright flash in the sky and a fireball falling toward the ocean. People on beaches and boats up and down the coast saw an orange glow, and then multiple streaks of burning debris raining down into the water. In a matter of seconds, the airplane had broken apart. The forward section separated, the center of the fuselage tore open, and the wings and tail came apart as fuel ignited. No distress call was heard. There was no time for the crew to radio a mayday or for passengers to brace. Everyone on board died in the breakup and the impact with the sea. What followed was one of the largest search and recovery efforts in American aviation history. Coast Guard ships, Navy vessels, fishing boats, helicopters, and divers converged on the crash site off East Mauritius, about 8 miles from shore. Wreckage floated on the surface in a wide slick of fuel and debris. Over the next months, teams recovered and cataloged hundreds of thousands of pieces from the ocean floor. The remains of the jet were moved to a hangar on Long Island, where investigators slowly rebuilt the center portion of the fuselage on a metal frame. Walking around it, they could trace blast damage patterns and bending of metal back toward a single area, the large fuel tank located in the wing center section, under the cabin floor. That tank had held only a small amount of fuel, but it sat directly above air conditioning units that had been running on the ground, heating the structure for a long time before departure. Inside, fuel vapors and air formed a flammable mixture. After years of testing and analysis, the official conclusion was that the center fuel tank exploded. The most likely trigger was an electrical short circuit that sent stray voltage into wiring connected to the fuel quantity system inside the tank. A tiny spark in the wrong place, in the wrong conditions, was enough to set off the vapors. The resulting blast blew the tank apart and ripped open the middle of the airplane, leading to the in-flight breakup. Because so many eyewitnesses saw a streak of light and a fireball, and because the crash happened just before the Atlanta Olympics, rumors of a missile or bomb spread quickly. The FBI ran a parallel criminal investigation for more than a year, interviewing witnesses, checking for explosive residue, and examining radar data. In the end, no evidence of an attack was found. The official accident report identified the fuel tank explosion, not a weapon, as the cause. TWA Flight 800 became one of the deadliest plane crashes in United States history, and a turning point in how regulators think about fuel tanks. For decades, designers had focused on preventing sparks, assuming that vapors inside tanks were unlikely to ignite. After this accident, that assumption died. New rules pushed airlines and manufacturers to add better wiring protection, reduce heat under tanks, and in many cases, use systems that fill them with inert gas so that any spark has nothing to ignite. ValuJet Flight 592 was supposed to be a cheap, simple ride from Miami to Atlanta. On May 11, 1996, a DC-9 sat at the gate with 110 people on board. The flight was already more than an hour late because of electrical problems. When those were signed off, the jet pushed back, taxied out, and took off over the Florida Everglades on a warm, hazy afternoon. For a few minutes, everything looked normal. The airplane climbed away from Miami, turning out over the flat green wetlands west of the city. Then, around 6 minutes after takeoff, people in the cabin began to smell something burning. A dull thump was heard. Lights flickered. The intercom failed. A flight attendant ran to the cockpit and shouted a single word the pilots never want to hear: fire. Unseen by anyone on board, the source of that fire was in the forward cargo hold, just below the passenger floor. Boxes labeled as company material contained more than 100 chemical oxygen generators, the same kind of device that feeds passenger masks if the cabin loses pressure. They were old, missing safety caps, and had been thrown in with tires and other equipment. As the airplane taxied and took off, at least one generator was triggered. It heated up, then set off others. Together they produced intense heat and their own supply of oxygen, turning the closed cargo compartment into a furnace. Up in the cockpit, the pilots suddenly had multiple problems at once. They smelled smoke, lost some electrical power, and heard the reports from the cabin. They called air traffic control, declared an emergency, and asked to return to Miami. The controller cleared them to turn back. On the radio, their voices sounded calm but urgent. Behind them, the fire was burning upward through the floor. As the airplane turned, the fire chewed through cables, insulation, and structure. Smoke pushed up into the cabin. Some passengers began shouting, "Fire," as the lights flickered, and the floor under their feet grew hot. Others never had time to unbuckle. The cockpit voice recorder picked up straining engines, short, clipped exchanges between the pilots, and then heavy breathing and background noise as the situation collapsed. Outside, fishermen and airboat operators in the Everglades saw the jet coming in low and fast. Witnesses later described the airplane in a steep right bank, nose dropping, no sign of a normal controlled turn. There was no long, shallow descent, no flare. ValuJet Flight 592 rolled past the point of recovery and plunged nose first into the swamp. The impact was almost vertical and at very high speed. The airplane disappeared into the soft mud and shallow water, leaving a crater and a spray of debris. There were no large sections of fuselage, no broken wings lying in one piece. When rescuers arrived by helicopter and airboat, they found only scattered fragments of metal, paper, clothing, and fuel on the surface of the water. Below, the wreckage and everyone on board were buried in a deep, muddy hole. There were no survivors. All 110 people died in the crash. Recovery teams spent weeks in difficult conditions, working among sawgrass, alligators, and polluted water, pulling up small pieces of the airplane and human remains. Many victims could only be identified through dental records or tiny fragments. Investigators eventually traced the disaster back to those oxygen generators in the cargo hold and to the way they had been handled. A maintenance contractor had removed them from other aircraft, failed to install safety caps, mislabeled them, and shipped them as harmless company material. Regulations already forbade carrying such hazardous items the way they were loaded that day, but the rules were ignored, and the cargo compartment itself had no smoke detectors or fire bottles to give the crew a chance. After ValuJet Flight 592, that changed. Class D cargo compartments like the one on this jet were effectively banned on passenger airplanes in the United States. New rules required smoke detection and built-in fire suppression in holds, and hazardous materials procedures were tightened across the industry. American Airlines Flight 1420 was a late-night hop that turned into a race against a storm. On 1 June 1999, an MD-82 left Dallas-Fort Worth for Little Rock with 145 people on board. The flight was delayed by bad weather, and by the time they neared Arkansas, a line of strong thunderstorms was crossing the airport. The crew were close to their duty time limit. If they did not land soon, they would time out and the flight would have to divert. On approach, controllers warned them about lightning, heavy rain, and gusty winds near the field. The crew tried one runway, then accepted vectors to another. Runway 4 right, a wet, rain-soaked strip with thunderstorm cells moving across the final approach path. Instead of holding or diverting, they pressed on, lowering the gear and setting up to land in rapidly worsening conditions. Outside, the windscreen filled with rain. Visibility dropped. The crosswind was near or above limits. They crossed the threshold fast and a little high. The jet floated down the wet runway before finally touching down. Almost immediately, the first officer said, "We're down, we're sliding." The spoilers, which should have popped up automatically to dump lift and put weight on the wheels, stayed down. They had never been armed. Without them, most of the airplane's weight was still being carried by the wings, and the brakes could not bite into the slippery pavement. The captain pulled the thrust levers into reverse, trying to slow down, but used so much reverse that the jet's rudder lost effectiveness. On the wet surface, in strong crosswinds, the airplane started to weather vane and drift. It veered off the side of the center line, still moving at high speed, then ran off the far end of the runway. Beyond the pavement, there was no long, clear safety area. The airplane tore through a chain-link fence and smashed into a rigid structure holding the approach lights for the opposite runway, a steel frame built out over the Arkansas River. The forward cabin and cockpit were ripped open. The fuselage broke into large sections, and fire broke out around the wreck. When rescuers reached the scene in the rain and darkness, they found shattered metal and scattered seats at the bottom of the embankment. Some passengers had managed to unbuckle and escape through breaks in the fuselage. Others were injured or trapped. In total, 11 people died, including the captain. More than 100 were hurt, many seriously, but 134 survived and were pulled out of the wreckage and down the muddy slope away from the flames. Investigators later concluded that there was no single hidden defect. The root causes were human and environmental. The crew were fatigued and under time pressure. They chose to continue an unstable approach into a severe thunderstorm instead of going around or diverting. On landing, they did not arm or deploy the spoilers, and the combination of wet runway, high speed, crosswind, and late braking left them with nowhere to go but off the end. Airport design also played a role. The light support structure they hit was not designed to break away, making the impact far more deadly. American Airlines Flight 587 began like any busy morning departure out of New York. On November 12, 2001, an Airbus wide-body lined up on runway 31 left at John F. Kennedy International Airport, bound for Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. On board were 260 people, mostly families and relatives flying between New York and the Caribbean. It was a clear autumn morning. The city was still living with the shock of September 11th, only 2 months earlier. Ahead of them, a large Japan Airlines jumbo jet took off from the same runway. Controllers gave the usual wake turbulence caution and cleared Flight 587 to depart a short time later. The takeoff and initial climb looked normal. The jet lifted off, began climbing over Jamaica Bay, and turned slightly left on its departure route. Then they hit the disturbed air left behind by the jumbo. The airplane shook as it flew through the wake. Small jolts like this are common and usually harmless. What happened next was not. The first officer, who was flying, responded with a series of strong rudder pedal movements, first one way, then the other, trying to keep the nose lined up. Each movement swung the tail harder. The rudder and the large fin at the back were pushed from side to side with growing force. Within seconds, the loads on the tail went beyond anything it had been designed to handle in normal service. The vertical stabilizer, the big fin that keeps an airplane pointing straight, tore away from the fuselage and fell into Jamaica Bay. With the tail gone, the jet suddenly had no stable backbone in the air. It rolled and pitched violently. Both engines, now under enormous twisting forces, also broke away and fell into the neighborhood below. People on the streets of Bell Harbor, a quiet residential area in Queens, looked up and saw the airplane coming down low and fast with pieces already missing. A few seconds later, the fuselage slammed into a row of houses, carving a path of fire and debris through the neighborhood. The impact and fire destroyed several homes and sent a column of smoke into the sky that was visible all over the city. There were no survivors on board. 5 people on the ground were also killed. In total, 265 people lost their lives, making it one of the deadliest aviation accidents in United States history. At first, many feared it was another attack. The crash site was in New York. The airline was American. The date was close to Veterans Day. Bridges and tunnels were closed, fighter jets went up, and news channels speculated about bombs and missiles. But as investigators pulled wreckage from the bay and the streets, a different picture formed. There were no signs of explosives. The key pieces were the broken tail, the engines that had separated, and the data from the flight recorders. The final report concluded that the wake turbulence from the jumbo ahead had upset the airplane, but that alone would not have brought it down. The disaster came from how the first officer reacted. His repeated aggressive rudder inputs, shaped by a training program that overstated the danger of wake turbulence, created side loads that eventually ripped the tail away. The structure itself did what it had been designed to do. It failed only after it was pushed far beyond its certified limits. Colgan Air Flight 3407 was a short regional flight at the end of a long day. On the night of February 12, 2009, a twin-engine turboprop left Newark for Buffalo with 49 people on board. Most were locals heading home. One was a man on his way to see his family, another a widow traveling with her daughter. The weather in upstate New York was typical winter. Cold, light snow, low clouds, and reports of ice in the approach area. The airplane, a Dash 8 Q400, cruised uneventfully toward Buffalo. In the cockpit, though, both pilots were tired. The captain had spent much of the day commuting from Florida. The first officer had flown in overnight from the West Coast and was fighting a cold. They chatted a lot on the way in, far more than standard procedures allow during the busy descent and approach phase. As they neared Buffalo, air traffic control cleared them for the approach. The crew switched on de-icing systems and configured the airplane to slow down, gear down, flaps coming out step by step. In icing conditions, the stick shaker and stall warning are designed to activate at higher speeds, giving extra margin. But the crew did not fully review their speeds out loud, and the captain allowed the airspeed to bleed away as they continued down through the clouds. A few miles from the runway, the airplane's speed dropped through the safe range. The autopilot kept the nose up to hold the selected altitude, hiding the feel of the approaching stall. Then, without much warning to the people on board, the protection kicked in. The stick shaker activated, shaking the control column and sounding the classic rapid rattling that tells pilots the wing is about to stall. In a properly flown recovery, the nose should be lowered and power added to regain speed. Instead, the captain did almost the opposite. Startled by the sudden warning, he pulled back hard on the control column and reduced the flaps. The pitch increased, the angle of attack grew, and the wing stalled fully. The airplane rolled and pitched nose up, then snapped into a sharp nose-down drop. In the cabin, there was no time for a calm announcement. Passengers felt a sudden lurch, then a violent roll and a feeling of falling. Loose objects flew. Some screamed. The flight attendants barely had a moment to react before being thrown off their feet. Outside in the dark above the suburbs of Clarence Center, the turboprop entered a steep descending turn. The crew tried to recover, but their actions were confused and mostly backward. The captain kept pulling, trying to raise the nose, which kept the wing deeply stalled. Power settings were erratic. The airplane sank rapidly, well below the altitude where any recovery was possible. It dropped out of the clouds at low height, nose down and banked, heading straight toward a residential area. At 22:17 local time, Colgan Air Flight 3407 slammed into a house on Long Street in Clarence Center, a quiet suburb northeast of Buffalo. The impact and fuel explosion destroyed the house, killed the man inside, and scattered burning wreckage across the yard and nearby properties. Everyone on board the airplane died instantly. In total, 50 people were killed. Firefighters and neighbors rushed into a scene of intense heat and falling debris. The fire burned so hot that it took hours to fully extinguish. In the morning light, the outlines of the aircraft were barely visible. Most of it was mixed with the remains of the house and garage. For many in the area, the smell of smoke and jet fuel and the sound of sirens became tied permanently to that winter night. Investigators pieced together the story from the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. They found icing on the wings but concluded that the airplane could have flown safely if handled correctly. The real problem was how the crew managed the approach. Fatigue, distraction, poor speed monitoring, reliance on the autopilot and icing, and a captain who reacted instinctively and incorrectly to the stall warning. Instead of lowering the nose and adding power, he pulled and trimmed nose up, sealing the fate of the flight. U.S. Airways Flight 1549 was an ordinary winter shuttle that turned into one of the most famous flights in history. On January 15, 2009, an Airbus twin jet left New York LaGuardia for Charlotte with 155 people on board. The weather was cold, but clear. The departure from runway 4 felt completely normal. The jet climbed over the Bronx and turned south, following the standard route along the Hudson River corridor. About 2 minutes after takeoff, at around 2,800 feet, the crew saw a flock of large birds directly ahead. There was no time to turn. Several Canada geese slammed into both engines, the cockpit filled with thuds and a smell of burnt birds. Almost immediately, the thrust on both engines dropped. The fans spooled down to a quiet, sickening whine. The captain said, "We're going to be in the Hudson," and took control. They tried to restart the engines. They ran a quick checklist. Air traffic control offered a turn back to LaGuardia, then a divert to Teterboro in New Jersey. The captain glanced at his instruments and out the window. The airplane was descending fast, with very little distance between them and the skyline. The numbers made the decision for him. They did not have the height or time to reach another runway. The only long, flat, open space ahead was water. He told the controller, "We're going to be in the Hudson," and began to shape the descent for a water landing. In the cabin, the drop in engine noise was obvious. Passengers later said it felt like the power had been turned off. A flight attendant shouted the brace commands as the river grew larger in the windows. There was no dramatic speech, no long build-up, just a few tense minutes, and then the impact. The captain aimed for the middle of the Hudson, keeping the wings level and the nose just above the horizon. At about 150 knots, the jet hit the water tail first in a shallow flare, sending a long plume of spray into the air. The fuselage slammed down, but it did not break apart. The airplane skipped once, then settled into the river, nose slightly down, water washing over the wings. Inside, the impact threw people forward, but the cabin stayed largely intact. Lights were still on. Overhead bins had stayed closed. When the motion stopped, the crew shouted for everyone to evacuate. Passengers opened overwing exits and main doors. Freezing river water began to seep into the cabin through the lower doors. People climbed out onto the wings, inflatable slides and rafts. some standing ankle-deep in icy water as they waited for help. On the river, ferries, tour boats, and police launches saw the airplane and turned toward it. Within minutes, boats were alongside the jet, pulling people off the wings and out of the rafts. Crew members helped transfer passengers, some in shock and soaking wet, into the warm cabins of the ferries. From the nearby shoreline and high-rise buildings, New Yorkers watched the rescue unfold in real time. In the middle of winter, in the middle of one of the busiest cities in the world, an airliner was sitting in the river with everyone standing on it. Amazingly, all 155 people on board survived. There were injuries, some serious, but no one died. For investigators, the technical story was straightforward: a dual engine failure from bird strikes at low altitude, followed by a forced ditching. The engines had ingested birds far larger than the certification tests expected. No checklist could give them enough thrust back in time. The only real variable was where and how they would hit. The outcome turned Flight 1549 into the miracle on the Hudson. Official reports later praised the crew's teamwork, clear communication, and disciplined handling of an almost impossible situation. Training in crew resource management and ditching procedures, along with the calm work of the cabin crew and the quick response of New York's river traffic, turned what could have been a mass casualty crash into a survival story. Most flights in the United States come and go without a story. You board, you land, you forget the flight number the same day. The crashes in this video are the rare exceptions, the moments when a flight number becomes a date, a headline, and a place that people never drive past the same way again. In a few hours of history, we have jumped between frozen rivers, swamps, suburbs, oceans, and big city airports. Every time, the pattern looked a little different on the surface: ice and snow, summer storms, cargo fires, fuel vapors, fatigue, training gaps, a flock of birds in the wrong place. Yet underneath, the same threads keep appearing. Small decisions that did not seem fatal at the time. Procedures that were good enough until the day they were not. Systems that were designed around what people thought could never happen. Modern American aviation sits on top of these wrecks. Stronger winter rules came from one river. Wind shear radar and escape training came from one approach that fell apart over Texas. Fire detection and suppression in cargo holds came from one jet that never made it back to Miami. Fuel tank protection changed because of one explosion off Long Island. Stall and icing training, rest rules, and experience requirements were rewritten after one turboprop fell on a house near Buffalo. Even the way pilots talk to each other and the way cabin crews prepare for impact carries fingerprints from these accidents. From the outside, it can feel as if the system is cold and mechanical, a set of procedures that simply arrived one day. The truth is different. Every checklist item and every line of a manual has a story behind it. Someone did not arm a spoiler. Someone trusted an instrument that was lying. Someone pressed on into a storm when they should have gone around. Someone pulled instead of lowering the nose. Names and faces sit behind each line in those books. For families, that is the hardest part. The rules that protect millions of strangers were written with the lives of people they knew. A mother on a winter business trip, a child flying home from vacation, a crew member who went to work expecting an ordinary leg and never came back. These are not just accident cases. They are the reason you can fly across this same map today and land without ever seeing what used to be in the fields around the airport fence. If you have watched this far, you are part of a small group of people who want to understand that hidden history instead of just watching a few dramatic clips. You are willing to sit with the uncomfortable details long enough to see how safety is really built, mistake by mistake and rule by rule. If you want more careful, long-form aviation documentaries like this, you can support the work very simply. Like this video, subscribe to Terra Obscura, and share it with someone who cares about these stories. It tells the algorithm that there is an audience for real investigations and real context, not just short edits. And it helps keep the memory of these flights alive in the one way that can still change anything today, by making sure their lessons are not forgotten before the next takeoff.